When we think about vulnerable global supply chains, our minds almost always jump straight to shipping containers or delayed electronics or maybe microchip shortages. But in this explainer, we're going to unpack a global dynamic that is mostly invisible, yet deeply, deeply visceral. We're exploring the absolutely undeniable link between Middle Eastern diesel and developing world food security. Because, look, while a delayed smartphone is definitely an inconvenience, the most vulnerable supply chain on Earth right now is the one that actually puts protein on the plates of billions of people.
The boats are staying in port, and when the boats stay in port, people don't eat. Let that sink in for a second, because that brutal, simple quote perfectly captures exactly what we are witnessing right now across the coastlines of sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. We usually think of global energy crises in terms of the prices flashing at our local gas station, right? Or maybe a higher heating bill. But for coastal communities in the developing world, a spike in fuel prices triggers an immediate, devastating chain reaction, where the literal math of survival just breaks down. The boats stay tied to the dock, and the local food supply simply evaporates.
So, to really understand why this is happening, we first need to define what exactly is powering the primary protein source for hundreds of millions of people. We are not talking about massive industrial factory ships processing tons of catch out in the deep ocean. No, we're talking about artisanal fishing fleets. Picture a small 10-meter wooden or fiberglass boat outfitted with just a simple 15-horsepower outboard motor. These humble fleets are the absolute backbone of coastal food security. And here's the kicker. They run entirely, 100%, on diesel. There are millions of these boats worldwide, and because they rely purely on this single fuel source, they are completely exposed to the wild swings of global energy markets. It's really a tale of two vastly different realities. Think about a massive industrial fishing trawler operating out of a developed port. For them, a sudden doubling of fuel costs is incredibly painful, sure. It causes a severe margin squeeze. But it's ultimately survivable because that corporation can just pass those inflated costs right down to wealthy consumers who are willing to pay for expensive seafood. But for a small artisanal fisherman in Senegal or Mozambique or Bangladesh, the situation is entirely different. A doubling of diesel prices means the simple math forces them to literally stop working. The cost of the fuel just to physically reach the fishing grounds becomes greater than the total market value of the fish they could possibly catch. Zooming out to the macroeconomic picture for a minute, S&P Global highlights a genuinely staggering number, 53.6%. That figure represents sub-Saharan Africa's sheer dependency on the Middle East for imported gasoline, and they have a comparable critical dependency for diesel, too. South Asia's fuel dependency is incredibly concentrated in the exact same way. Entire regions are basically tethered directly to the Persian Gulf. So what happens in the Middle East definitely does not stay in the Middle East. It's pumped straight into the fuel tanks of those millions of small wooden boats we just talked about. And the crucial takeaway here is that when geopolitical events block Gulf fuel exports, let's say a closure of the Strait of Hormuz pushing Brent crude up to $108 a barrel, that macro shock instantly ripples down to the local level. Diesel prices in developing coastal countries don't just, tick up a few cents, they surge dramatically, jumping 40 to 80% above pre-crisis levels. It is an immediate, catastrophic disruption of the local economics of fishing. It literally halts food production overnight. Section 1. The protein collapse. When catching fish becomes too expensive. The sheer reliance on fish for daily survival across the globe is almost hard to overstate. Globally, the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization notes that fish provides 20% or more of the animal protein intake for roughly 3.3 billion people. That is a massive baseline. But when you look at the regional data, it gets even more intense. In several West African countries, that number climbs to 30 or 40%. And in Bangladesh, a full 60% of their animal protein comes directly from fish. When you cut the diesel supply, you aren't just cutting fuel. You are directly cutting the primary protein source for a huge portion of humanity. We really have to remember that this isn't about skipping a luxury meal. In Western nations, if a specific type of fish gets too expensive at the grocery store, shoppers might just pivot to buying chicken or beef instead, right? But for the communities we are talking about, fish is often the absolute cheapest, most accessible animal protein available. It's survival protein. When the boats stay in port and fresh fish supplies collapse, these communities do not have a backup plan. They can't just pivot to expensive poultry or beef. They simply go without animal protein entirely. Section 2. Taxing every calorie. Beyond the fishing fleets. Because the shockwaves of this diesel crisis absolutely don't stop at the coastline. Diesel acts as the invisible lifeblood of the entire rural food value chain in developing countries. The exact same dynamic paralyzing the fishing fleets is suffocating the farms too. It's a chain reaction. Step 1, farmers need diesel to power their tractors to plow the fields. Step 2, they need it for the water pumps that keep vital irrigation systems running. Step 3, once the grain is finally harvested, post-harvest processing slows down because the grain mills are passing through their own surging fuel costs. And finally, step 4, transport trucks need diesel to move the food from the isolated farm to the central market. Every single time a drop of diesel changes hands in this chain, the food becomes significantly more expensive. To put that into perspective, because of limited road infrastructure and the vast rural distances in many of these regions, transport alone can make up a staggering 30 to 50% of final food prices. Just imagine that for a second. Imagine if up to half of your entire grocery bill went solely toward covering the gas of the delivery truck that brought the food to the store. That's the reality here. So a surge in the global diesel supply chain drastically inflates the cost of eating before a single seed is even planted in the ground. Higher diesel prices act like a brutal, invisible tax on every single calorie produced, processed, and sold in the developing world. But unlike a regular government tax, which might theoretically, be recycled into domestic social programs or schools or local infrastructure, this diesel tax extracts wealth with zero public benefit. The money is literally siphoned straight out of domestic food systems and flows directly overseas into the pockets of oil producers, leaving local economies and rural food networks significantly poorer at every single stage of the process.
Section 3. The unseen crisis, invisible to the global markets.
So, despite the massive scale of this protein collapse, you might be wondering, why aren't you hearing about this on the global financial news? Well, it's because this crisis flies completely under the radar of commodity trackers. The global economy simply doesn't measure the daily struggles of untracked village markets. No Wall Street analyst is covering the economics of artisanal fishing fleets. These million-plus small boats are entirely uninsured, and their daily catches go completely unreported on any global indices. You can trade futures contracts on soybeans, crude oil, and frozen concentrated orange juice all day long, but there is absolutely no futures market for fresh tilapia at a local village market in Mozambique. Because it isn't tracked on a screen in New York or London, to the global financial system, it's basically as if the crisis isn't happening at all. So the ultimate takeaway here is the stark, kind of heartbreaking disconnect between macro-level geopolitical maneuvering and the intimate human cost it extracts. On one side, we have global conflicts in the Gulf, tensions over nuclear ambitions, shipping lane blockades, and great power rivalries. It is incredibly high-stakes geopolitics. But on the exact opposite side, we have the true collateral damage. A solitary fisherman in Bangladesh staring at his empty outboard motor, knowing he simply can't afford to fill his tank, and knowing that his community will not eat today as a direct result. To wrap up this explainer, I really want to leave you with a vital question. Knowing how deeply the diesel supply chain impacts survival protein and fundamental food costs for billions of people, should there be a humanitarian diesel exemption for artisanal fishing fleets in times of global crisis? How do we even go about protecting the world's most vulnerable food supply chains from these massive geopolitical energy shocks? It's a lot to think about, and I highly encourage you to share your thoughts on this down below. Thank you so much for joining me to unpack this crucial topic, and I'll see you in our next explainer.